Hello everybody, welcome to the latest episode of Games Up Podcast. It's just me this week, although it was supposed to be Lewis as well. We had some really major internet connections. This is like the 7th time trying to record this, so I'm really sorry that it's just me this week, because it was supposed to be like a full podcast, but it's just me rather than myself and Lewis. Nonetheless, it is a full podcast in every other form, so let's get straight down to the news. And the news starts with Kingdom Hearts 3, a really, really highly anticipated game, has been revealed to be coming out at 2018. It was revealed at D23, which is a big weekend that Disney run. It's kind of like E3 or Comic-Con, but exclusively for Disney stuff. Lots of details coming out of it for like Marvel and Pixar stuff. We got the first details of The Incredibles 2 and Avengers Infinity War. But games-wise, of course, there is only really one major game that Disney have in the next few years. Obviously, that's without like the Square Enix Marvel stuff, but that's Marvel Video Game Studios, so it's kind of different. But the big Disney game is, of course, Kingdom Hearts 3. There was a big reveal trailer with Toy Story stuff. Don't think it's Toy Story 4, think it's just generally a sort of Toy Story world as it tends to be in Kingdom Hearts, but it might be cool if actually we saw some details of Toy Story 4 in it, considering that movie is coming out a couple of years after the game, if the release date of 2018 that was revealed is to be believed. I've got to admit, I'm a little bit sceptical here, but I think I'm just generally sceptical of Square Enix release dates as a whole. All the stuff that's come up over the last few years with Final Fantasy, and then the Final Fantasy remake, and then Kingdom Hearts kind of being pushed back and not talked about. I'm a little bit sceptical here, but I got to admit, of all the games slated for 2018 so far, this is probably the one I could see hitting the most, maybe after Red Dead and one or two of the first-party exclusives. So, there you go, Kingdom Hearts 3, Toy Story World, and 2018, that was one of the big pieces of news this week. One of the other big pieces of news was the reveal of further details of Pokemon Go's real-world events. If you're in the UK, next week we have an event in Chester, which is all about the history of Chester, and they're opening up the castle for the first time. It actually sounds like a really, really cool event. Over in America, they're holding GoFest in Chicago, and what happens in GoFest will have effects in the game for everyone, no matter whether you're at an event or not. You can find those details on the Reddit, the Pokemon Go Reddit. They're also on the Silph Road Reddit, and the Silph Road is like a network for Pokemon Go players, so you should go check that out if you are still playing the game. If you're not, you should start playing the game again, because it's really fun. There's some big events coming up this weekend, might catch you back into it if you've lost interest. Another piece of news this week comes again from D23, where we got another video about the upcoming PS4 exclusive Spider-Man. It was framed as a kind of behind-the-scenes video, with Insomniac giving us a kind of exclusive-y view as to what the game would look like, what it would play like, where their inspiration came from. And I must say, the gameplay that we saw in this video looks a little better than it did in the E3 demo, in my opinion. It looks a little bit more open, it looks a little bit more fluid, and a little less sort of button-mashy. I must say, I'm still pretty skeptical about this. I think it still looks too Amazing Spider-Man-y to be entirely separate from the games that came before it, and I've made my thoughts clear on that before. You can check them out in last week's video, which is Should We Be Worried About Spider-Man? But the game does look better in this update, and it's nice to see Insomniac talking so openly about the kind of inspirations they've taken and the direction that they want to take the game in. The final piece of news this week was all about Game, which is a massive games retailer in the UK, if you're listening from anywhere else. The piece of news that came out was that Game has had a major bunch of its shares and stocks bought up. It was about 20% of them, I believe, by a retailer called Sports Direct. Now, Sports Direct in the UK are known for being a very, very budget sportswear retailer. They sell kind of workout gear and tracksuits and pretty basic sports equipment and trainers. And they sell them at pretty cheap prices, not like amazing, eyes popping out of your head prices, but the lowest you'll probably find them in a supermarket, and certainly competitive with online. Although they are known for being less than great with the way that they treat their employees, for example, and having a bit of a spotty track record as far as company ethics go. So this got people worried about the future of Game, wondering whether Game is going to go the same way as Sports Direct, or whether Game is just going to go away entirely. So we thought what we would do this week is discuss how we would make Game great again. And then we thought about reaching out wider and asking lots of people what they thought was the problem with Game these days and how they would improve it. So last night we reached out to lots of people on Facebook and we got lots of responses, and we're going to go through them one by one, presenting different ways that you could fix Game if you were so interested. We'll start with friend of the show, Robert McLaughlin. Rob says he thinks Game has been on the brink for a long time now because of the competition it's faced in the digital market. It's much more convenient to purchase games at home on your console, and with the crash of stuff like the Amiibo market, there was even less reason to go into stores and buy physical items. He thinks that the way they could pull it back and become great again was to focus back on the generations where buying physical was really encouraged, where there was less digital games and you could only get physical copies of those games. We suggested that maybe Game could do something around the launch of the mini SNES, so that the people who were more likely to queue up for that console for hours are also more likely to keep coming back into Game to buy physical copies of maybe games that they've missed from their childhood or games that you can't get anymore. Another friend of the show, Kelly Potter, suggested that maybe Game was too far gone already. She said that she already goes into CEX to get cheaper prices on used games, and that whilst there is stuff like merchandise in Game, it's not really enough to make her want to go into the store and come out with anything purchased. We suggested that maybe one of the other ways that Game could pull in more people would be exclusive merch, something that you couldn't get online, something that wouldn't be cheaper on Amazon or a merch store, and that you could only buy in-game, something that incentivizes you to go in there and see them as a specialist in something. And a fair criticism that she said in response is that the problem with that is you'll still have competitions from stuff like comic shops, from stuff like HMV, and even supermarkets who are now buying into the merchandise Game because Game did originally. It's a fair point, and I kind of agree with her here. I don't think merchandise is going to be the thing that saves Game, even though it's kind of kept it from dying so far. Another friend of the show, Nathan Zero, suggested that something that Game could do is start to have exclusive areas. We talked back and forth about the Game in my hometown, Milton Keynes, which now has a little gaming room and a dedicated VR space. And it's not entirely a dedicated VR space, it's more a kind of space on the shop floor where they make sure they can show off VR areas. But we thought that would be a really good way of getting people back into Game and also getting them spending more time in Game. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes. And then we also shared this thread into a private group on Facebook called Podcast Unlocked. It's a fantastic podcast that IGN do about Xbox every week. I am a member of the group and I'd recommend it, and we got a lot of responses on there as well. The first one comes from Dean Agassi, who suggested that he would like to see games focus more on the local scene, that they have lots of big shops in big shopping centres in massive popular cities, but that might not actually be doing them any good and making them look more generic. I think this is a really, really good idea. A problem that Game is going to have is that in major popular city areas, internet connections are typically going to be pretty strong, so they'll be competing much more so with digital storefronts. In local areas and much more rural areas, the Highlands in Scotland is a great example, internet connections are still lagging behind a little bit, so there's less reason to buy games digitally. The download times are ridiculous, the connections are awful, and maybe people just won't see value in them. Instead, having a local store presence where people see a sense of local community is more likely to get them to not only go into the retailer, but respect what the retailer is doing and respect the culture of the retailer as well. That's something that we'll talk about in a minute as well. The next response we got was from Jamie Harvison, who suggested that one of the big issue Game faces at the minute is that his stores are a bit too cluttered. He said, and I quote directly, "There's bits of everything in there. It's almost like they're trying to compete with everyone." And I really have to agree with him here. I've never really understood why Game was selling used phones, for example. I can't imagine there's many people who are really looking at Game as the top used phone seller, and I can't imagine that dedicating the space on the shop floor to it is making them look any more specialist or actually making them any more money. Now, obviously, I know wrongly because they wouldn't keep doing it if it didn't make them money, but a big problem they're going to have is that the more they try and diversify what they sell to appeal to more markets and bring in more people, the less they're going to look like a specialist, and the less people who are part of the hardcore market are going to want to go to them. This speaks actually, I think, to a bigger problem that we'll get into when I make to you my pitch about how I would save Game. But it's the age-old problem of balancing out the larger casual market to the more focused and more engaged but much smaller hardcore market. And I think Game have overstepped the line a little bit too far, where they appeal to so many people that they don't actually really appeal to anyone. We had another response from a gentleman called Christopher Scott Smith, who explained that he was from the US and tried to buy something from Game. He specifically mentioned the physical version of Halo Wars 2, which only got a physical release in Europe. He mentioned that he tried to buy it from Game, but that their customer service wasn't great. I guess good customer service is something that every shop should do, but actually, being able to ship exclusives like that to other parts of the world might be a really good way for Game to show themselves as specialists as well. And this is another thing I'll tie into my pitch to you for how to make Game great again. And then the final comment we got from that group in Nick Graham, and his response was, generally, the prices are too expensive. Supermarkets, Argos and online compete far harder with Game than Game has ever competed, and they just need to lower the price of the games so that people have more reason to go in there and buy things. I think that's totally true. Game is massively priced. Games themselves are very expensive, so that's always, I think, going to be the case. But I agree that the prices are very high, and what you're getting in-game is not really specialist enough to value that kind of price point. Then we had one more response from friend of the show, Dan Owen. This was less about how you save Game and more about how you compete with it, but actually it's a really interesting idea. Dan compared Game to the Maplins or PC World of the gaming industry in that it's a good gateway store, but it's not really good at what it does, and it's not particularly specialist. When we asked how he would prefer to see Game improve, what he would like to see them do instead, his response was a high street Amazon store. And actually, I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. Now, I think the way he meant it was a literal high street store. But what if Game maybe was more of a high street store for a digital interface, so that their overheads were really low, the shops could be very small themselves, but they could minimise the effect on the game's prices and sell them pretty cheaply? That would be really interesting. It's something we've kind of seen work in shops like Argos, where you don't really have like a storefront, you have more a kind of digital interface, although it's less based online, so that's not a perfect analogue. But I think that is something that could work if Game really wanted to totally revitalise what they did, although it would be a massive risk, especially considering the competition they already have from places like Argos, supermarkets and online. So now it's time for our pitches about how we would save Game. The first comes to you from Lewis, although I'm going to have to say it for him because of the internet issues. Again, sorry for that. The two ways that we would save Game or make Game great again go in two very different ways. So we'll start with Lewis's, and Lewis says, basically, go entirely pre-owned. Very much in the same way that CEX does, so that they're not having to compete with the price of new games, and they can focus on pricing pre-owned games as cheaply as possible. This would appeal to the casual gaming market, but not to the casual everyone else market. They'd still be seen as a specialist gaming store, but really only for the casual consumer who wants to go into a game shop on a bit of a whim and come out with one or two games that they've bought there and then. They'd obviously have the same kind of monetization that they have with pre-owned games at the minute, where they wouldn't have to give any money to the developers or the producers in the first place, so they would keep all the money of the games that they sold, whether rightly or wrongly. That's a discussion for another day. And they'd be able to focus much more on games, thus alleviating a bit of the clutter of their shops. They could get rid entirely of the used phones, for example, of some, if not all, of the merch, so that what's being sold in-game is games and games alone. I think this is a viable way to do it. My thoughts on pre-owned are probably well known. I think I've made them well known in shows previous, and I'll make them known now. I'm not a fan of it at all, and again, that's a discussion for another day. But CEX has shown that it's totally viable, and in fact, CEX as a company are not in an amazing place, but their stock prices are on the up, so maybe this is a much healthier way for Game to do it. My pitch to you for how to make Game great is a bit more ambitious, but I think it could work. The first thing I would do is scrap pre-owned entirely. See, I personally think that Game is never going to be able to compete with CEX. I think CEX have had 4-5 years now of cementing themselves as the place to go for pre-owned games. They undercut Game's prices, and I have no qualms that they'd be able to do the same even if Game went entirely pre-owned. I think the best way that Game can continue is as a specialist new game provider. So what I would do is scrap pre-owned. Scrap pre-owned entirely, scrap the merchandise, and scrap the used phones, and replace it with something that we haven't seen in many years. Demo kiosks. Now, you may be thinking, that doesn't make any sense. Demo kiosks are dead. I don't want to go in and play with the sticky controller that's been left by a 12-year-old kid. But I'm going to put it to you in a bit of a different way. As I already mentioned, the game in my hometown, Milton Keynes, has a new way of approaching this. It has a specific little booth/tiny room where you can go in and play. The last few times I've seen it, it's been playing rounds of Overwatch where it's had people set up against each other. But I think a more specialist approach to the demo kiosk would be a really cool way to do it. if instead of having just kiosks set up on the shop floor, you had a booth area where you could go in and play 2 or 3 demos of the latest games that have come out this week. Make me go in and spend 40 to 45 minutes to 50 minutes in that shop. In fact, what if there was a coupon that a member of staff could give you for playing each of the demos that came out this week? What if games started to become almost the new version of an arcade? Rather than going in, browsing the cheap crap pre-owned games, browsing the used phones that you're never going to buy and looking at the overpriced merch, you went in to play games. What if in a year's time I could go in before I've bought a copy of Red Dead and play half an hour of Red Dead? And then when I've played half an hour of Red Dead and know, wow, this is amazing, because of course it's going to be, it's Red Dead, a member of the game staff comes over, offers you a coupon code for playing the demo the whole way through and says, hey, you took the time to come into this shop, you took the time to play games with us, we're going to give you a bit of money off towards the game so that you have more reason to come in here next week, spend more time with the game, spend more time with the staff, and hopefully buy more games as a result. In my opinion, it's a massive, massive shame that with the digital marketplace, what we haven't seen the resurgence of is demos. We've started to see it again this year with stuff like Doom and Battleborn getting demos and free trials, but it's still not quite where it was, and it does need to get better, I think. The reason that it's so key for digital marketplaces is because digital marketplaces can make you download a demo, you play the half an hour demo, and then they give you an option there and then to buy the game. They make sure you have no reason to step into a game store. You can play the game at home, you can play the game for free, and then you can buy the game if you like it or not. The best way that game could compete with this is building a culture around playing games. You're not just going into the shop to play a demo, you're going into game to play in their arcade area. You're going into game to interact with the staff who know about the games that have come out that week. You're going into game to get the money off, potentially, for the game that you've played the whole way through. You're going into game to be an engaged customer, and you're getting and reaping the rewards for being engaged with game. I remember years and years ago when I was much smaller, game used to be the place where gaming lived. I remember going in, and I'm sure many of you will remember this as well, playing the demo for Rockstar Table Tennis. Rockstar Table Tennis probably would not have had anywhere near the success it did if it weren't for that demo kiosk, if it weren't for everyone being able to play Rockstar Table Tennis and identify, that's a really good game. So I think game needs to get back to reaching out to the highly engaged customers that it used to have, by reaching out to the hardcore. There's another good reason for this, and that is the casual consumer has no interest in keeping game alive. See, the hardcore, super engaged customer knows the value of gaming having a physical presence and a physical shop. I really like the idea of gaming having a place where everyone goes in to buy games. It's like the awesome communities you used to get building around record shops or bookshops or arcades. It's somewhere that's specialist and people know is specialist. It's somewhere that friendships and communities and groups can form. It's something that we really haven't had for a good few years now. The casual market doesn't have any stake in games surviving. If Amazon can undercut them entirely in the next couple of months, why would they go to game again? If CEX or supermarkets or Argos can undercut them, why would they have any reason to go back there? The casual market has no real interest in keeping game alive and no real stake if it dies or lives, whereas the hardcore are more likely to want to see game continue, especially if it's in a different form. The hardcore recognise the value of the game brand, they recognise the value of what game and game stores once did, and they recognise the value of what it could do again. I think game needs to go out and reach out to that hardcore again. It needs to make itself the specialist it once was, and it needs to make me want to go in there not to look at how cheap and crap everything is, but to go in there to learn about games again, to experience games again, and to play games that I wouldn't have put my hands on otherwise. A couple of other little thoughts for you on the side of this topic. The first is that generally one of the responses that I got was that people didn't seem to think that the staff were treated very well. In fact, I had one person reach out to me specifically and tell me some pretty grim examples of how the staff were treated at game. Now, it goes without saying that an unhappy set of staff can't provide a good experience to a set of consumers, so I am not accusing game at all of treating their staff badly, but if that is the case, I think it's worth noting that a happy group of staff and a satisfied and specialist group of staff will always make for a better consumer experience. Another thing that was reflected quite frequently is that people stopped going to game after GameStation was closed. In fact, people kind of felt that GameStation did it better, and one of the reasons for this was because Game has become a place where you go to buy popular games, right? It's become the place where you go to buy the top 10s or top 20s of games, or the top 2 consoles that are out at the minute. Whereas GameStation had a more wide-reaching catalogue. You could go in there and find hidden gems, games that you never thought you'd see again, or games that you'd never heard of before. This, I think, comes with the territory of being a specialist, and I think if Game were able to rid themselves of pre-owned and work more towards the kind of premier gaming experience they once were, they might be able to reclaim that crown of being a place where gaming lived. Another final point for you on this. In America, GameStop faced many of the same issues that Game faces now, and one of the ways that they started to get around it, or one of the ways that they changed their business, was by reaching out to developers and publishing their games exclusively through their stores. They even published an Insomniac game and signed up studios like Ready at Dawn. I think this is a really, really interesting way to go, and I think Game could do a similar thing in the UK, especially as there are less publishers in the UK than there are in the US. It would be really nice to see Game give the opportunity for some indie developers to make their first game and make their name in the industry, although this would be a much more risky thing to do. Publishing their games exclusively through Game would mean that there would be only one place where you could buy that game, so the marketing behind it would have to be absolutely on point to make a success of it. If it worked, it would make Game an absolute champion, in my opinion, because it would mean that indie developers get a chance that they didn't have before, and it would all be done to a publisher trying to change their business for the better. If it didn't work, it could actually be pretty damaging to the UK indie scene, depending on how many developers worked with Game or how much money Game put into it. So it would be a massive risk, but it's definitely something that they could do. Anyway, those are your thoughts and our thoughts on how maybe we could make Game great again. What did you think? Would you go with my pitch or Lewis's pitch, or would you go with a new pitch entirely? What did you think of the ideas that we got from other people? I thought they were all fantastic, and thank you all so much for joining in with the post. It was really, really lovely to see everybody commenting on it and being involved. It was really, really nice. If you like what you heard here, we have a Facebook page, a Twitter page, a YouTube, and an iTunes. We would love to see you on all of them. You can subscribe depending on what you like. The Facebook and Twitter page are Games Upcast. The YouTube and iTunes are Games Up Podcast on both. You should be able to search them and find us. Of course, you're listening to one of them right now, I hope. We publish at 6:30 every Monday on YouTube in the evening, and much earlier that day on Monday for iTunes, so that people can get it on their way to work and stuff. Subscribe, please, to one or both if you'd like to continue getting this, because we'd love to have you along for the ride. Thank you very, very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully, it will be both of us back next week, and my internet will stop being an arse. But until then, thanks for joining us. And the game's up.